Nehru to Gandhi. As a historian, these words back. President Nehru writes, it is many years, he writes this on 9th October 1945. He writes to Gandhi, it is many years since I read his Swaraj, but even when I read it 21 years ago, it seemed to me completely unreal. As you know, Congress has never considered that picture, much less adopt. Then he goes on to say, the world was different when those ideas were propounded in 1909. Many years since Swaraj was written, the world has completely changed since then. Anyone when any consideration of these questions must be seen the present facts versus nothing on the future. Otherwise, it will be revolved from here. It goes on to other things. Gandhi writes, in reply, I have said you are my heir. It is only proper that I should at least understand my heir and my heir in turn will understand me. I shall then be at peace. Gandhi was very anxious to understand what exactly were the differences in him and Nehru. And then Nehru writes, the next letter was around November. He says that, very soon we are going to be independent, just 2 years before, a year and a half before independence. And Nehru says, it is inevitable that modern means of transport, as well as many other modern developments, must continue and be developed. If that is so, inevitably a measure of heavy industry exists. How far will that fit in the purely village society? Then he goes hammer and tongue, the whole idea of idealizing. And he says, I quote, independent India must protect itself from foreign aggression, both political and economic. This requires that India develops herself into a technically advanced country. Gandhi's reply was also and later debate. He says, I will lie. One more passage where he writes, Gandhi to Nehru. I found it very fascinating. The Tagore Gandhi debate that I looked at. Gandhi says that in his view, the idealization of village that Nehru attributed is based on the fact that he is in favor of simplicity. And why simplicity? Because simplicity is manageable by the individual. The larger the scale of technology of systems of government, the more it is outside the individual. And then the last few lines I'll read out. He says, my ideal village still exists only in my imagination. After all, every human being lives in the world of his own imagination. And then the sum and substance of what I want to say is that the individual person should have control over the things that are necessary for the substance of life. If we cannot have such control, the individual cannot survive. Ultimately, the world is made up only of individuals. What you see here is Nehru being sort of statist. And you can say Gandhi is not an artist. To me, the significance of this is that Nehru made clear to Gandhi well before the Republic was born that the Republic was not going to follow the country. And that becomes clear in the first 2 decades of Nehru's regime. You know, barring symbolic gestures toward small-scale industry or handicraft development and so on, there was scarcely anything of Gandhi's agenda the Republic took up. I see the younger generation in the Congress by and large being increasingly critical of the Gandhi. You will remember perhaps Ambedkar, for instance, when some of the Gandhians in the assembly proposed a panchayat system of government at the local level. Ambedkar opposed it fiercely. He said that this another of Mahatma Gandhi keep the underprivileged in the position they have been for centuries. And he said the village government needs the control of to sum it up, what I want to look at is not only a kind of harmonious discourse development from the beginning of the 20th century, but also very strong, differences, clashes, and this in some way tells us something of what the future of the Republic will be. I think in my book, I tended to kind of paper over the crack and look at the harmony in their friendship, as you said, a great friendship. Yes, a great friendship, no doubt. And this was the generosity of great people to tolerate it. The differences, I think, ought to be highlighted. And what do you think of these, do you see this dissonance within the discourse as significant?
Actually, I was struck by that sentence you read from Gandhi to Nehru. I must understand my heir and my heir must understand me. And I think that is the nature of the Gandhian legacy. There's a kind of mutual misunderstanding between Gandhi and all of us who are his heirs. And I think Nehru was the midwife of that misunderstanding. But I think that, it's a question of emphasis. I mean, an idea like Swaraj, which to me is quite central in my book and in my entire understanding of the reading of Indian politics, even today. This is quite apart from the fact that Arvind Kejriwal has written a book called Swaraj, which one should read out of curiosity for any other reason. That Swaraj has two components of Swa and Raj, and the self and sovereignty. And I think Gandhi's emphasis was always on the self, and Nehru's emphasis was always on sovereignty. And the latter is the direction that India took. However, I think Nehru is right to, in a sense, return to Hind Swaraj as late 1945, after World War II is over, on the eve of Indian independence. Because, that text, this is again something that I have argued at length, I mean, it's a Galilean text, it's a paradigm-changing text, it's a manifesto. It makes and it drives Indian nationalism for several decades. But at the same time, like many manifestos, I mean, it exhausts itself. And so Nehru is right to both return to it, but also to say that, it's played the part that it had to play, and now we move on to the
Maybe,
nitty-gritty.
I don't know, do you think it's so that maybe, something that would work in the realm of ideas, when Nehru was really trying to create that nation and, set it on the path that it had to take, maybe he thought, as Sir is saying in his writing, that, the ideas which Gandhi was proposing in the Hind Swaraj wouldn't work possibly, he thought, in reality. And maybe that's where that argument stems from, because Gandhi is so deeply embedded in this thought of the self and, the individual. He's spoken about it so often.
The individual is only the first of the many different layers of selfhood that he's interested in. And ultimately, he's interested in the collective self and the selfhood of India and the selfhood of humanity. But managing that self and managing its relationship to power and the desire for power, that is really what he's after. So, it's not a question of reality and realization. I think that is a misreading of Gandhi. He was never trying to tell you how to govern anything. Right? It is an act of political imagination. It is an attempt to reorient the very conceptual foundations of what it means to live a collective life and what role violence plays in that, right? And what position we should take vis-a-vis structures of authority, right? This is altogether at a different level of abstraction and questioning than the everyday nitty-gritty business of running any kind of a state or a nation or a political entity or an administrative project of any kind. And I think Nehru's success is partly that he is able to, and I argue this, he is able to partake in both, the political imagination, which is necessary for a certain kind of nationalism, and then transition into realpolitik and pragmatic administrative functions that he has to fulfill. But again, he's not at all alone. He's not the author in a sense of the new India. And somebody like Ambedkar, I think, provides a very interesting check at all points. Before independence, during the constitution making process where he plays such a big role, and then immediately afterwards, when he has his falling out with Nehru pretty early on and throughout the 50s. Because, Ambedkar is clear-eyed from the start about Gandhi's methods, right? And he's critical also. And he calls them the grammar of anarchy. And he says, look, now you're adopting a constitution, now you're becoming a republic, and these methods of satyagraha and so on have to be transcended in favor of different technologies of dealing with issues of sovereignty and governance. And in a sense, all these ideas and the strains between them are very interestingly being played out at the present moment, yet again. And we see them sort of dramatized and performed for us in a way that, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, it would never have occurred to me that somebody of my generation would get to see, what actually happens when, a chief minister sits on a dharna, right? In a way that echoes Gandhi, perhaps without the kind of halo that we put around Gandhi's, figure. And you immediately see the incoherence of the two kinds of project, right? A very, very critical project which is questioning, the very foundations of sovereignty, and a very practical project of trying to build, a better governed India.
Actually, that's interesting what you say. Because the thought often crosses my mind that there's a huge paradox. Ramchandra Gua the other day published a book on Gandhi for India in the African days. And we, Hardiman and many others have done so. They point out that you see people like Martin Luther King or Mandela and Shukri Verma and many others have been inspired by that. And some of them have commented that, in India, there are fewer followers of Gandhi than elsewhere. I think Ramchandra was saying something at that time. Now, it's not the historical Gandhi who has come back in this way. It's some other Gandhi. It's a Gandhi we have constructed in our own time. You see, Gandhi is, in his Swaraj, that anti-consumerism. We read in a totally different light. Then again, when he talks of the environment, that science of environment doesn't exist in his time. So unless you attribute to me a prophetic side, you have to say our construction. And it is true that he essentializes the West in a very remarkable, actually in a somewhat admirable way. For a man who knew the West so well, to essentialize the West in that manner is very odd. But my question to you would be, Anantya, why does it? Gandhi is not, I'm not assuming that Gandhi is not lying. He knew things being different from what from the West depicted in for us. If he's not lying, then he is mistaken. This is also difficult to believe his acquaintance with the West of quite close, and was acute insight. What is the explanation? Why is he doing this? I think maybe, this essentialization is something he gets from the Gita. To get back to your Gita. You see, he is looking, this is a dialogue. Remember, there's the only book Gandhi wrote, which is a dialogue between the super editor who answers questions and the like the Gita again, this is a dialogue. It is a very traditional Indian form of exposition. When I was a child, I used to read out to my grandmother from Punjab. And that always begins with the dialogue between Shiva and Parvati. Where Parvati says, "Oh Lord, how is the next year going to be?" Now, I think Gandhi deliberately adopts this form. Therefore, what he says about the West is what Gandhi is speaking. It is a dialogue between the West and the East, and thus he feels free to essentialize it. It is not as if Gandhi is giving his judgment on the West there, but he is just presenting a dialogue between two stereotypes, so to speak, ideal types. That's a possible way to look at it. Otherwise, I don't understand why Gandhi wrote that book the way he did. What is your take on that?
I think he wrote the book because he couldn't not write the book. I believe this. I think he had an epiphany, and that accounts for the suddenness with which he wrote it, the speed at which he wrote it, the circumstances in which he wrote it on this boat, and the point in his life when he wrote it. He had spent 20 years in South Africa. He was on the verge of returning to India. He hadn't yet been recognized in India as any kind of figure with political significance. I think things fell into place for him. And not just things about India and the West or British power and sovereign power and India, Swaraj, British Raj, whatever. But the entire world, as it were, his understanding of the world sort of fell into place in a moment, and he wrote it out. But
what do you make of all this about hospitals, about medicine?
yes, but
railways.
Sure. So the dialogic form of it, I think, is pretty intelligent. Not only does it draw on forms of argumentation that are familiar to Indian readers, it's also Socratic. It's also more engaging because it allows two points of view to be juxtaposed. But I think it also comes out of his experience as an editor of journals and his polemical experience, as it were, in intervening in public debates. I've also read that in some ways this was, the actual addressee of this imaginary dialogue was Savarkar, or were others in the Indian National Congress on the one hand, and among the more kind of violent and anarchist groups on the other hand, extremist groups. So he could have been modeling some real life interlocutors, as well. But I think that the critique of technology, the critique of modernity, the critique of consumerism and a certain kind of capitalist economics, and the critique of a Hobbesian state and of sovereignty premised on the monopoly of power and violent power. I wouldn't actually read those as being essentially about East and West. I think he had, a take on the idea of sovereignty as such, right? And if you were to be genuinely convinced by it, then you would agree with him that it's